All right, how do you want to start? Do you want to do a Jake Ture intro?
Is that like no intro?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Yeah, let's just do that. I mean, people, if they're clicking on this, they know your name or they know my name. So I guess we'll just kind of start with what we were talking about right before we press record.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll just continue. So I think the within American college athletics, between like 2005 to 2015, the idea around it, whether or not you should do Olympic lifts, the dominant culture behind it was you have to do the Olympic lifts. You have to learn a full clean, a full snatch, a split jerk, a power jerk. You have to learn all of this, and if you don't, you're missing key qualities of athleticism that you really can't get anywhere else. And if you don't do the Olympic lifts, you're not going to develop as a holistic athlete fulfilling your potential. At some point, probably in the later 2010s, 2016, 17, 18, I think there was kind of this push of you don't have to Olympic lift, but now that pendulum has become you shouldn't Olympic lift. And I think I think many of the people pushing the idea that you shouldn't Olympic lift because it's a waste of time. And then they want to look at like force plate data and look at like very negligible, I don't want to say meaningless, but not super important metrics on a force plate. They'll look at like eccentric rate of force development on a trap bar jump versus hang clean. We'll get into the participants of those types of studies anyways
Yeah.
later, but they'll try to rationalize not using Olympic lifts with things like force plate data of eccentric rate of force development, things like that. Kind of this, yeah. Um, they'll try to rationalize it that way, and I think in their minds they are like the they're the scientific ones. They're the ones that are looking at data. They're the evidence-based ones, but they're just missing in reality, they're missing the holistic outlook on it. So yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think the the people who
There's
say that,
there's things I think there's value in Olympic lifts that aren't necessarily quantifiable that
correct.
people are missing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's just the value in developing different skills. I think that's the biggest value. And that's a huge that's what I think. That's what I was writing about last night was like I just feel like there's a huge disconnect between the ability for your athletes just to acquire different skills in different contexts, and this is just one context that they can develop in. But then going back to your point before about like the pendulum swinging, it just that it's so interesting because it's like the people who are saying that you don't have to Olympic lift or you must Olympic lift are literally the same people.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
reflections of each other. It's like saying nothing matters and everything matters. Well, you're the same. That's the same person. So it's so important to see both sides and make sense of the gray areas when you're developing these programs with people. But yeah, it's funny. Let's talk about the metrics because I think the metrics are really interesting. So we know that people fantasize a lot about force plate data, whether it's like, do we really need another counter movement jump study? Like, do I really need to see what that looks like? And
Right.
yeah, it's really interesting about how people can apply that data. And it was something I was speaking to about with Rob Gray, and he was saying how a lot of the baseball teams are investing so much money in development in biomechanics, and so like they've got these detailed analysis of the body and what it's doing at different positions to reduce injury. But it's kind of like the force plate data. I think like we are mounting all this information and there's all these studies, but I just don't think it's going to find the answers that coaches are trying to find solutions to. I just don't think that that's where they're going to find like where they're going to solve their own problems. It's not in the force plate data.
No, not at all. That's why I don't know. In a lot of my like YouTube titles or Instagram posts, I'll call things meaningless, and people don't really understand what I'm. It's not like that I'm saying that the outputs themselves are meaningless, but like the overarching theme behind a lot of the concepts are kind of meaningless. Like they don't provide value that many think they're going to provide.
Yeah, that's like that's literally the whole conversation. And I feel like people pretend that they're like, oh, don't have, no dogma approach, anti-dogma approach. But the reality is you're kind of missing the whole point. So I feel like when people start, like a very common comparison at the moment is like, say people just trying to do contrasts, or people trying to do Olympic lifts with and comparing them to trap bar jumps. So say, for example, and the strength coach that is putting the video up is power cleaning 40 kilos. And it's like, okay, well, let's have a real low resolution of what's actually happening here. That is such a low stimulus exercise, like a 40 kilo power clean. Like whenever I see power cleans online from strength coaches, it's usually 40 kilos. They've got the Eleiko bar, and it's just like, dude, I don't know what's going on there. Like if you just understand, like one of your principles has to be that you value creating a high level stimulus for your athletes over picking movements that you think are like better or more optimal. I feel like that's the solution to the optimality discussion, is just picking the greatest level of stimulus.
Yeah. So I want to hear your take. So there was this Jordan Newsma, he's a nice guy. I've met him before. I've talked to him. But he tagged me in an Instagram post comparing. I want to say he was comparing like average bar velocity of hang clean versus a trap bar jump, and he was using the same loads for both. So you're doing a trap bar jump with 40 kilos, or you're gonna do a hang clean with 40 kilos. And I just gotta hear your take on it, because in my like, why are you using the same absolute loads? Like I can jump with 40 kilos on a trap bar, nothing's gonna go wrong. I can jump with full max effort, nothing's gonna go wrong. If I clean 40 kilos with full max effort, I'm gonna throw the bar through the ceiling. Like these aren't comparable loads. If you want to compare the two and look at some sort of metric, you have to use like relative intensities that are comparable for both. So yeah, I want to hear your take on that, because I sent that to you, right?
Yeah. It's kind of like
Yeah.
the argument of like making the athletes at the end of the session do tons of sprints. And for some athletes, it's like that's you're making them run at like tempo. And for some athletes, like 50% of their best sprint, and other athletes are just dying. So it's like having that, although it's like we've controlled the situation by picking the same load, it's not at all the same situation. It's not at all the same stimulus or the same output. And especially one's using a different bar. They're both completely different tasks. So the most important part to understand is all those metrics are task dependent. So when people talk about power is the most interesting one, because power is task dependent. So work over time, but what's the work you're actually doing? So if you're jumping with a bar that's connected to you and it's a part of you, you're not going into the same positions where you're creating propulsion on an external mass, and then you have to go straight into triple flexion. So, and then again, you have to control that power output. Like you just said, you can't use all of your energy into one lift. You actually have to do a slower first pull, or if it's off the hang, you may have to take the slack out. If it's off the blocks, you have to take the slack out. There would be very different pre-activations happening in the body, and then pre-activations as you're receiving and moving under the bar. So from just like a pure task perspective, so understanding the skill first, they're completely different. So they're obviously going to have completely different outputs. So then we're trying to measure things like bar velocity you can see maybe without looking into it too much, maybe it could be comparable, but when you start getting below the surface and understanding what's going on behind the scenes, those two things are completely different. It's like, yeah, they're not even the same thing. But so then the fact that those two movements should compete for the same slots in a program is also pretty like flawed. And then we have the discussion of like, well, doesn't really matter, and that comes back to it all the time. It's like, it doesn't really matter which ones they do, but those two movements are completely different. So it's really
Yeah.
difficult to make comparisons. And then as intensity increases, I feel like so many people, do we really, anyone who walks into the gym can do a trap bar jump. Like
Right.
any person can walk into the gym and just do a trap bar jump straight away. So from a skill perspective, we're not really challenging the athletes to learn anything new or overload them in different ways. And that's something that I think I know I'm jumping around a lot, but I really like how Franz Bosch talks about it, and Rob Gray, how they say overload is like learning new skills is overload, and how you're creating new sensory motor packages and how that's going to stimulate you as well. So it's like what we were getting back to earlier about before we started recording was how a lot of things that we're trying to quantify with the Olympic lifts, or when we're trying to make comparisons, aren't necessarily quantifiable. And that gives a lot of anxiety to coaches, because then they just did this whole degree where they're trying to have the science behind everything they do. And
Right.
then they don't necessarily have the metrics or the abilities to measure these things.
Yeah. So like the whole like return on investment kind of phrase has been popularized over here. I don't know if it is in Australia, but like in the long term, like what is going to provide a greater return on, like obviously the investment is the training, the time, the effort, the time to recover, all those things. That's the investment of your training. The return is what? It's like the adaptation. Like, what's the adaptation you are eliciting via a trap bar jump versus what's the adaptation you're eliciting via a full learning the full snatch, the full clean, a power jerk, a split jerk, and then all of the variants with all of those exercises too. Like the obviously the Olympic lifts are going to produce a much greater return on investment in the long term. Like again, if you're viewing Olympic lifts through the lens of producing power, and you have a short term mindset, yeah, in 8 weeks, maybe the trap bar jump is going to contribute to like a greater improvement in sprint performance or jump performance for an athlete over the course of 8 weeks. But what about 8 years from now? Um,
But
and
the other
then
thing
so
is,
with
Lil,
the
oh yeah, go
yeah, keep going.
on.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if trap bar jumps make your sprinting better in 8 weeks, how shit are you at sprinting?
Hey, you're right, exactly.
Like,
You're so severely untrained that anything is going to work.
well, the thing is, if your sprints got better, like if your 40-yard time dropped by 0.2 or 0.3 right now, and you attribute it to the fact that you did trap bar jumps, yeah, you've got to wonder, like, you must have been running some really bad times. That
Yeah.
doesn't make any
And so
sense.
I went and did that experiment that Jordan had posted on Instagram just because I wanted to see it. I wanted to try it. Um, I think I could jump. I could maybe jump like less than an inch. Like I could jump just as high, so you could like slide a sheet of paper under my feet with 180 kilos on a trap bar. Like barely get off the ground.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I can clean 180 kilos on any given day. So like when you really start loading up, you can, I mean, not all the Olympic lifts because I can't snatch that much, but I can clean way more weight than I can jump with. And then if I'm barely jumping with 180 kilos, at that point it just turns into like a Louis Simmons West Side dynamic effort deadlift. And then I don't know, I charted this all out. I should have brought this up.
Yeah.
I like charted this. I like made this kind of like load velocity profile just for fun. And like you can tell I can just load up and move the bar and move the heavier bar cleans way better than a trap bar. And that's always used as the justification. Not always, but oftentimes that's used as the justification for why you should do a trap bar jump or a barbell jump or some other loaded jump, is because you're moving this weight at a certain speed and it's produced because power is just a math
There's a
equation.
sweet spot. There's a sweet spot for power.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You're just combining the two optimal force and velocity to create a greater power output. But it really isn't even true if you are working with an athlete who is, I wouldn't say I'm like super proficient at the Olympic lifts. I'm just like competent enough that I can perform it and get a good stimulus out of it. So if you're using people who suck at Olympic lifting, obviously the bar path is going to totally S curve, and their timing is going to be all messed up. There's going to be so many technical flaws that it's not even worth looking at any sort of data with, anyways.
But okay, before we move on, so then on that, so with the work that you do, how many of the people that you work with, this is at North Dakota at UND, how many of them do Olympic lifts?
Good question. So I just got switched with the team that I work with. So I used to work with men's basketball, women's volleyball, tennis, and football.
Yeah.
Volleyball athletes, I did have them Olympic lift. Tennis, I didn't, and men's basketball, I didn't. Now I work with women's golf, men's golf. Women's golf, they do Olympic lift. Men's golf, they don't. I'm still with tennis. They don't. And I work with softball players. They currently don't, but they will later on once I've been like more comfortable with them. So I can get into the reasons why not for certain teams.
Yeah.
Which I think.
Let's do it.
So I think it's totally fine to say. It's totally fine to say I'm not going to Olympic lift these athletes because I just don't think like the time and effort is worth it due to the logistics, the scheduling of their training sessions, the equipment you have, how big the group is. I just don't think it's worth putting in my time to teach them to get good at the Olympic lifts. Totally fine. Not totally fine to say to try to make a merit-based argument that the Olympic lifts are bad. Not fine. So softball, talk about softball that I work with right now. They lift 2 days a week. They're on the road 4 to 5 days per week. Their lifts are 40 minutes each. And it's like 25 girls. I've only met them for like 4 months at this point. Had no idea what I was walking into. And that's really why they're only going to lift twice a week for 40 minutes. I just rather get them strong. And they're so untrained anyways. They're 18 to 22-year-old girls. If we just front squat, back squat, RDL, pull up, push up, bench press, they're going to get much more athletic for a long time, So that's why I don't with them. Men's basketball, I really wanted to. Some of the guys really wanted to. But if you've ever worked with basketball athletes, half the guys just hate lifting. It's like pulling teeth to get them to do anything in there. And I was just like, now I'm not going to spend my time trying to get you to not going to spend my time trying to get you to learn how to hang clean from above the knee if you're going to not want to do it in the first place. And then your effort's going to be poor. It just wasn't worth it for me. Tennis, kind of the same situation with softball. They lift 2 days a week for 30 minutes. And half the weeks they don't even lift. So like I'll get a text from their coach at 3 p.m. when they're supposed to have a 4:30 lift saying he's canceling the lift. So I just haven't really had a good time to like implement that stuff. But I'm totally a proponent. If you have the time, you have the necessary resources to include it. Totally a proponent for pretty much everybody to do it. So yeah.
So obvious, is this something that you've changed your mind on? Or is this something like, say, when you first started working at UND, where you're like, okay, I already know everybody's going to power clean. I'm going to teach everybody a clean pull. Is that something that you change your mind over the years?
Good question. I was super naive when I started coaching.
Well, we all
so I love the weight room, obviously. That's why I do what I do. I guess I kind of assumed that everybody else loves the weight room too. And I was a football player where in football, there's a cult, like a weight room culture in football. So I was around other guys who like lifting. So I actually did back in 2018, 2019, I tried to implement the Olympic lifts with tennis. But again, it's like I got a 19-year-old girl who weighs 125 pounds who could barely even like get the bar into a front rack, just an empty bar, 20 kilos. And it's just like, no. So I think, yeah, I've changed my mind. Now I assume that athletes don't want to lift, whereas before I assumed they did want to lift, and that totally changes the way I approach training for college athletes.
Yeah, that's awesome to see that change as well. Like, yeah, I feel like you have to go through that. So then a lot of the stuff that I see online, like particularly Twitter, I've only been on Twitter for maybe a month, and I'm still unsure what I think of it. But the general consensus is from a lot of popular coaches is you can never be strong enough. Like you can never be strong enough. But then as someone like for yourself, and then using the argument of, well, Olympic lifts don't make you strong. And that it's kind of like a clickbaity, it's kind of like they're baiting and fishing for something there, because obviously strength is an expression of skill. So you can express strength through various skills. It's a lot easier to express your strength on a chair sitting down doing leg press than it is through a snatch. But the through a more difficult coordination pattern. But then where do you see that you can't be strong enough like emerge in some of like the things that you do? Or like, is it just particularly like football? Is that like that culture where you just need to be strong enough, or is that just like a old meathead mindset?
I don't really understand the question.
Yeah, you know how people talk about like you can never be strong enough, or strength's never a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about
That
that?
slogan. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, what do you
I
think about
mean,
that?
I don't know. So I would agree in the sense that like once you've hit like a requisite level of strength in certain contexts, you don't need to continue to pursuing greater strength expression in that context. But I would never say don't train for maximal strength anymore. Just find other ways to provide a maximal strength stimulus in other contexts. So like if you can squat 600, if you can back squat 600, but your front squat, you haven't front squatted very much, so you can't express strength in a front squat. Start front squatting, and you still get the stimulus that you need to improve strength, but you're broadening the context in which you can express that strength. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
I would agree so much. Yeah, it's
That's
it's
where it's
just
like just keep varying different exercises and find ways to like get better, get stronger.
yeah, and that's something that I think is awesome about the Olympic lifts, like doing the split catches, complexes. If someone just wants to, for a lot of the athletes, the variability for some, unless they're like really really weak, but for a lot of them, like the variability side of things is just going to add a bit more novelty in their training as well if they're just playing their sport so much. But yeah, I think that's it's such an interesting thing how coaches will just view it as like you must learn the back squat. Was like, no, you must learn how to squat. And there's so many ways you can do that.
The variability thing with the Olympic lifts is hugely underrated, I think. Um, like if you know how to full clean, you know how to full snatch, you know how to split jerk, power jerk, um, you know how to do it all from the hang, you can do it from the blocks, you can do different complexes, you can do pulls, low pulls, high pulls, jump shrugs, you can do all of the different variants and I guess drill work maybe for all the Olympic lifts. Think about you're never gonna run out of you're never gonna run out of training stimuli because you can always add variety to your training if you know how to do all of those. There's so many combinations that you can put together. Whereas if going back to the loaded jumps comparison, I mean, how many different ways can you load a jump? You just can't. I mean, if you're really creative, you can. I can figure out a lot of different ways to load a jump, but still, you're jumping. Jumping itself is going to you're going to run into some law of accommodation at some point if you're only jumping. But here's the other thing too. If you're not doing Olympic lifts, you can never just throw them in if you're not proficient in them, if you're not competent in them. But if you can do them, you can always take a break from the Olympic lifts and do other means of training for a while and throw Olympic lifts back into your training later on. I think the whole variability thing with Olympic lifts is hugely underrated.
Yeah, that's I think that's where a benefit of, or where one of the larger benefits lie. It's yeah, just understanding how to create a different stimulus. It just comes back to that one principle. Do you know how to create a stimulus? Do you know like what is the intent behind your sessions? So I think maybe that's where a lot of people also go wrong when they're trying to define. They don't have a clear, and I know this is true, and probably people might disagree, but I know for a fact people do not have well thought out intents behind what they do. If you were to question them on the things that they do or the training that they currently have, it would literally fall apart. They would really struggle to find answers and reasons behind why they pick certain things. And it's not, sometimes it's just like it doesn't matter. Like sometimes it's just like, well, we're going to squat. We want them to get stronger legs. And I love the video that you've done on variations. And I couldn't agree more. It said so well. It's like they'll do a similar thing. So, like, the squat variation, like what's the difference between a front squat and a back squat? It's like it's a squat. It's
You just
very
get stronger legs, man.
you get stronger legs. That's all that happens. And I think for a lot of people, that's like, oh, it's such high IQ, but
Yeah.
it's crazy. So then, yeah, trying to divide the time up in the training week. How are you if you're deciding on Olympic lifts or not, just purely due to resources? Is that you have clear intents behind the sessions that you're trying to design for your athletes, or are you just like currently, we're just going to do a little bit of everything each day. We're going to do movement preparation. We're going to do some kind of lower body strength, and you kind of have it in the you mentioned before, you have like those basic movement patterns you want to tick off each session. Is that kind of how you design the sessions? Or I know for your own training and for the Haas concurrent, maybe let's talk about the Haas concurrent, because I think that's really interesting, and how you go about designing those sessions and whether or not to include Olympic lifts in that training week.
Yeah. Okay. So Haas concurrent. So we Olympic lift 3 days per week. I really don't know how I decided on that frequency. I think I originally had it in there for 2 days a week, because I marketed it on Train Heroic as like advanced or intermediate athletes. So like assuming if someone's an intermediate or an advanced like trainee, I guess you should assume that they at least know how to do most of the Olympic lifts. So I decided 2 days a week, and then like within the messaging part of the app, I just asked if they wanted more, and a lot of people said they like Olympic lifting, so we'll do more. So we do 3 days a week. But yeah, we're gonna hit snatch every week. We're gonna hit a clean every week. I honestly hate doing jerks because I suck at them, so I don't put that in as much. So we'll either snatch twice, clean once, or clean twice, snatch once, and then maybe if we're cleaning, I'll throw a jerk in there too. So it'll be like a clean and jerk type of complex, something like that. I want to do something to get my legs strong twice a week, something to get my upper body strong twice a week. I want to hit the Olympic lifts 2 to 3 times a week, just because I think they are, like we stated earlier, they are such a unique set of exercises that provide such a unique stimulus that really can't be replicated at doing anything else. So I want to hit that 2 to 3 times per week. And then I want to do something for my aerobic system a couple times per week. And I want to do something that's, I'll call it athletic, a couple times a week, sprint, jump. And that's the way I structure it. And then really I kind of pick the exercises randomly. There'll be like 2 to 3 to 4 week waves where we do the same exercise, but with a slight variation. So it could be a front squat 1 week, a front squat from the pins week 2, a front squat to a box week 3, and then back to a regular front squat week 4, something like that. And then with the Olympic lifts, it's be a lot of complexes because we're not training to go to the Olympics. I'm not training for like a 1 rep max, clean and jerk and snatch. So we're just gonna get good at all the variants of the movements: hang clean, full clean, clean from blocks, tempo cleans, pause cleans, whatever it is. So that's kind of randomized the specific exercises, the specific variants that we do. But I want to hit those a couple times a week, 2 to 3 times a week. That's really it.
So then do you have like any landmine clean and jerks in the program?
None. I hate those things. Do you ever use those?
No. What about
You
dumbbell?
see the videos of them, people doing them?
This one where they like turn it?
Yeah. What
There was a guy
I don't
doing
want to
it.
say it. I don't want to say that stuff's bad because all training is better than no training, you know.
Yeah, but that's not
But
a that's not a good argument.
but I think again, they're trying to replicate the Olympic lifts without actually having to do them. That's really what I think they're doing.
Just do the Olympic lifts. Yeah, at that
And
point, just
it's actually way harder to do an Olympic to do a landmine clean and jerk than just a regular clean and jerk. Have you tried to do the Olympic lifts on a landmine? It's so clunky. The bar like slides in and out of the sleeve. Just the way that it's in that that axis, it like rotates differently every single time. That how you're able to like time up your feet coming down to the floor and catching the bar in like the landmine front rack position. It's all screwed up. Um, there's no rep to rep consistency for anybody doing it. It's way harder than a normal Olympic.
So then something that I find like really interesting, obviously like everyone's trying to like get the edge, and whether that's just looking, whether that's that training makes up 10% of their program, which it probably does, or maybe even less. What do you think about those? I don't know what they're called, but the ones where you can do like a sprint start with the weight and kind of press the weight out of the rack. Have you seen those before?
The jammers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like again, it's fine to do, but I'm probably never going to find enough value in that I'm going to make that a priority in training. You know, that's my view of it.
Yeah, 100%. So
Well,
then,
a lot of it is you'll be standing in a staggered stance, and a lot of it will be leg drive into a press into a step. You know, and it's like which one are you doing? Are you working on like leg drive? Or are you working on pressing with your arms? Or are you working on like stepping through the finish? You know, you're trying to combine all of these three things. The coordination pattern gets all screwed up because you don't really know what the intent is. Like, what's a good rep? What if you have a really strong leg drive, but you can't time it up with the press, and then you can't time it up with the step? You know, like I don't really know what you're accomplishing.
yeah, it's
I couldn't
interesting.
judge what a good rep is. I couldn't say that's a good rep, that's a bad rep because it's going to look different for so many different people, rep to rep.
So then going back to the load selection for Olympic lifts. So now we've said we kind of addressed a few things, we addressed a few myths, but when it comes to now, all right, well, how much does someone have to lift, or how proficient does someone have to be in the Olympic lifts for then it to be a viable option for us to say, okay, I know what adaptation you're getting from it now. Like I obviously can define that as a good quality rep. Like I was watching some videos of Werner Gunther do some weightlifting the other day, and his power cleans weren't, I'm a snob. Obviously, Olympic lifting is what that's the main thing I do. That's what I want to be known for, and they're the main kind of athletes I work with. But they weren't like the prettiest power cleans I've ever seen. They were pretty much just like a turnover. He did 180, kind of just muscled it up. He didn't really catch it that deep. His elbows are pretty low, but I could see that he's getting a pretty fast. He's going from triple extension to triple flexion. He's getting a follow through. He's producing a lot of lower body force. There's 180 kilos flying up through the air. It has to be done from his lower body to some extent. So, like, is there a lot of people will say that maybe Olympic lifts, it's hard to find the proper dose, or it's hard to find the proper, hard to find a level of stimulus. But I just don't believe that there's a magic load, or there's a magic weight where you can get benefits from doing them, assuming that you're not having to fight for resources in time or the program. I just don't think like them by themselves, there's not a magic load.
No, I would agree with that. And as far as like how proficient someone has to be in order for it to be like a useful training method, I don't really know. A lot of that's probably going to be subjective to the coach's eye. But like if you can hit certain landmarks within the movement pattern, you're probably good. Like as long as, let's just talk about the first pull, for example. If your ass isn't coming up right away, or transitioning from the first pull to the second pull, if you're able to like maintain your back angle to a certain degree before getting vertical so you don't have the bar hit your knees. Like the bar you're patient enough, let the bar cross your knees before you bring your hips forward and get more vertical. Things like that. If it's really clunky, yeah, it's probably not super productive at that time. But then that's why you take the time to get better at it, at the movement pattern. And then 3 weeks, 3 months, who knows how long it takes for someone to get better at it. But down the road is probably going to be a pretty effective stimulus and training method for most people to use. So, yeah.
100%. Yeah, and that's a big part of it. Just understand, like coming back to that, when we're trying to divide up our training or trying to allocate slots to training, just what kind of thing are we trying to drive? What adaptation are we trying to drive, rather than we're trying to drive this metric, and that's where things get really weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really have much to add after that.
Nah, that's really good. Yeah, it's kind of
Do
just like
do you want
the
to, hey, do you want to go through some of these takes?
yeah, dude, let's do it.
Let's do that.
I feel like we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm talking like a retard too.
Fuck.
Um,
No, you're not. You're doing good. I'll
I'm
edit it
I'm
up.
looking through your notes here.
All right, tell me.
All right. Weightlifting needs to. Oh, okay. Here we go. Weightlifting needs to be fast to make explosive power. Here's your take on that.
What is explosive power?
Good question.
What is explosive power? Well, it's so task dependent. So yeah, I just it's really hard for
It's load dependent too.
yeah, well, that's the
It's
thing.
load dependent too. Like, yeah, if obviously if you have more load, the velocity is going to drop, and that's going to the whole context of the task changes. So
Something that I've
weightlifting
always
weightlifting needs to be fast to make explosive power. That doesn't mean anything.
well, so this is the really interesting thing. In order for you to be successful at any weightlifting attempt, they're usually fast. So bar
It's
speeds,
got to be, yeah, it's got to be fast enough for you to
regardless of the
get up back
load,
on the bar.
regardless of the
Yeah,
load. So the really interesting thing, and this is what Mladen talks about in agile periodization, when he talks about VBT, velocity-based training, when he talks about that, he says, well, it just doesn't really solve as many problems for a lot of people because bar speed's so constant in weightlifting. There's a bandwidth of velocity that you need. And it's fairly narrow. As load increases, people are more thinking the bar won't continue to float up as high or for as long. Obviously, it's heavier. It's going to want to start to fall quicker. But the velocity that you can produce in that second pull, I would argue if we plotted a lot of your lifts from 40 kilos to 180, it would be very consistent because you're having to modulate that force, and probably
right.
towards that 140 to 180, the bar velocity or the peak velocity is actually not dropping off as much as people think.
Yeah, well, I've made this point before that what's so great about the Olympic lifts is that you have to produce high forces, you have to produce high power outputs, but you have to be precise about it too. Like, you can't just rip on the bar as hard as you can without any regard for precision and accuracy. It's not going to be a successful rep. And I think that's hugely underrated in the Olympic lifts. I don't know. Here's a question for you actually. Would you say that the Olympic lifts, we'll just say clean, inherently includes a decelerative component to it? Would you say, well, yeah, would you say that's true? That the clean inherently includes a decelerative component to it?
I've never thought of decelerating in clean. I feel like the bar drops because gravity is going to pull it down when I get under the bar, but I've never thought of like actively decelerating it. If anything, I'm thinking
Yeah,
of it's purely
I
an
totally agree.
acceleration movement. If we look at things like acceleration levers and the way the body's organized during an Olympic lift, the shins are forward. It's the whole body's in extension. Everything we're trying to do is to create acceleration. Then we have to go back into triple flexion fast. So we've got that fast eccentric there, which everyone's like getting really excited about lately. I feel like they just found out what a fast eccentric is. And if you mean like if there's a decelerative part of it, well, you rebound the bottom, you've got that yielding type movement where you use the stretch reflex and you get into that deep squat, create a lot of pressure. The decelerative part might just be standing up and getting crumbled by a heavy clean. The actual pull is very dynamic.
Yeah, so I've heard the take that you are actively decelerating after your pull to get back underneath the bar, which isn't true.
No,
No,
definitely not.
yeah, you're accelerating the bar, but then you're accelerating yourself back down. You're not thinking about it's not an inherent deceleration. You know, I mean, you just described it better than I ever could. But the whole like, why would I use a movement that inherently includes a deceleration component to it? Well, that's like a that's like a false premise. You're not.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting take. I never thought of it like that. Probably wouldn't. I probably never would say that. Yeah, and even just like watching weightlifting, I feel like there's also a huge disconnect in weightlifting and sports performance where they'll make the argument like that's weightlifting, this is performance. It's like no, they're exactly the same thing. I've never seen. I would never coach someone differently or explain the movement differently to someone who is a weightlifter and who is an NFL player. It's kind of like that NFL specific clean and then weightlifting clean. Thanks, guys, for listening. Hopefully, you can take some cool takes from this from Will and I. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram, Will the Hoss, and I'll see you guys soon. See you then.
Take care, guys.